Hello and welcome to week 3 of EDUC 749. I hope you've had a good week and a good weekend. My family spent the whole weekend in Detroit at a volleyball tournament, so we got home about 9 o'clock this evening and wanted to get this video posted before the weekend got over. So we will jump into Module 3. A couple of things that had come up in the last module was as we talked about ILPs and IEPs. Just wanted to provide some additional information on that and distinguish that when I use those terms, I'm really using those terms as two separate plans, ILPs being for students with limited English proficiency, IEPs being for students with disabilities. That may be slightly different than how they're used in Illinois, but that's typically what I'm used to. You can have one of those plans and not the other, or you could have both of those plans depending on the needs. As I looked a little bit more into Illinois structure, because some of you had questions about what's required for ILPs or for students with limited English proficiency. And so it appears that in Illinois there's two different types of programs that are required dependent on how many students from the same language are enrolled at each school. So if you have 20 or more students, you're required to offer a transitional bilingual education program, TBE. If you have fewer than 20 students, it's a transitional program of instruction, and there's some additional information that's required there. It is also important to note, and some of you would have far more experience with these types of plans and terminology in Illinois than certainly I would. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of information about that. It's also important to note that services for students that are learning English, limited English proficient, are based on federal requirements. So there were a couple of times in papers or discussions over the last couple of weeks where it was commented that services for kids that are limited English proficient aren't required by law, but they are. And so there might be some different requirements, but these were some of the federal requirements that specify that students with limited English proficiency are required to have really protected civil rights as they go through their educational experience. And so just wanted to clarify that as we move forward. IDEA is specific to students with disabilities, but as you can see here, there are some protections federally that our students who are learning English have as well. As we prepare for this week's videos, there are three. The first one is Fat City, and when you look at this, you might think I've lost my mind because it looks like this video is straight out of the 1980s, and it is. But it is a great video as you think about what we have done. Many of you talked about in your discussions and your papers this week about how important cultural competence is and that we can understand the needs of our students and put ourselves in their shoes when we come from different backgrounds and different life experiences than our students. That's exactly what the Fat City video does, is it puts us into the experience of being a child with a learning disability. And so this really is a classic video in the world of understanding learning disabilities, because Richard Lavoie does such a great job of highlighting just what it is that our students with learning disabilities experience when they go through school. So it is dated, but it's a great video. There's another video that's shorter that's about embedded supports, talking a little bit more about universal design for learning, specific evidence-based practices and how we can embed those supports into our instruction, and then specifically how we're using technology tools to do that as well. So that will show you some different tools that can be used for students, specifically those with learning disabilities. And then finally, there's a video, and it's a longer video as well, but if you read the directions, I give you a specific time that I want you to watch, starting at about 40 minutes and ending at about 57 minutes. And in that video, Dr. Yell is really talking about how do we see the IEP process and how it links for our students with disabilities from their assessments, their present levels of performance, to the goals that we write, and then the services that we provide. And those things should really be should be tied together as we look at combining them for a student's IEP and meeting their needs. And so several of you had questions this week about wanting to learn a little bit more about the IEP process and specifically goals. And so Dr. Yell does a great job of highlighting those key areas, and he says that really the present levels, the data that we collect on the front end of an IEP, are the driver. They're what set us on our course for that year. What are the goals that we're going to write for that student? What are the services that we're going to provide? So that Dr. Yell's presentation will provide you with some background knowledge on those areas that we will build on in the next few weeks. I think we've covered this. The other thing that he really emphasizes that will become important too as you think about your assignment for this week, where you research a practice or a strategy that you learned about that you want to dig into a little bit deeper. One of the things that Dr. Yell emphasizes, and that is required in federal law for students with disabilities, is that their services be based on research, that we should not just be doing something because that's what we've always done for kids with learning disabilities, for example, that it has to be based on research. We have to know that it's an evidence-based practice before we include it in a student's IEP. So as we think about goals that would be written for students, I'm sure many of you are familiar with SMART goals. Those apply just as you're thinking about how you would write a student's goal for an IEP. It has to be specific. It has to be measurable. One of the things that you'll hear Dr. Yell talk about is one of the things that special education has been bad about is simply putting a percentage into a goal and then calling it measurable. And he'll cite some case law that shows that is not defensible. That's not a good way to write a goal unless it's tied to that specific present level that you can show clearly that percentage is an accurate measure, an accurate benchmark that you want the student to get to within a year. And that gets to the achievable part. Can that student meet that goal within the course of a year? An IEP is in place for 1 year, and as several of you pointed out in your assignments last week, you can always meet within that year. You can always change goals, you can adjust, but you're writing that IEP, you're writing that goal, thinking about what can that student achieve in the next 12 months. Is it relevant? Does it make sense within what we're wanting the student to do? With the present levels, the key priorities that we want that student to improve upon. And then timely. We know that an IEP is written for a year, so that we're already bound by a time as we write that goal, because we know it's got to be addressed within a 12-month period. So we'll dig in some more on goals, but I wanted to give you a little bit of background before you watch Dr. Yell's presentation. In the text this week, there are several key factors, and again, these might be things that you want to dig into more deeply as you do your assignment this week. And several of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with some of these strategies. They're good for all kids, but specifically in this chapter, they talk about how they can meet the needs of our students with learning disabilities. So graphic organizers, whether that be for reading or for writing, are great strategies to help our kids with learning disabilities get their thoughts on paper and get themselves organized. A KWL chart, having students outline what do they know, what do they want to know, and what did they learn after they read. That's another great strategy that I'm sure many of you have been using for some time. In the chapter, they also talk specifically about some mnemonics, and mnemonics are research-based and really can be helpful for our kids with learning disabilities. And so they provide some in reading, the SQ3R, which I reference on the next slide. SQ3R is before a student reads, and the focus is on reading comprehension. You're teaching them to survey, look over the text, find some of the key information just by scanning, surveying the text. Question, formulate questions and write them down. Then read, knowing that you've already got some idea of what you're reading for before you actually jump into reading. Then recite, answer the questions out loud, putting the information into your own words, and then review. Go back and review your notes, your highlights, and clarify anything that you need to. This is a practice that's been around for a long time to help kids with reading, but it's a great mnemonic way to get kids to focus on what they can do specifically to better comprehend passages that they're being presented. I gave you it listed here just an example of a KWL chart. I'm sure, like I said, many of you have used this before. Another practice that's mentioned in the textbook are manipulatives for math. They also give a mnemonic RQWQC that's specific for math and math problem solving as they're doing story problems. So you can look through the chapter and find some of those other mnemonics or strategies that you think might be beneficial for your students or that you want to learn more about. The other thing is we talk about special education being based on research and the things that we're doing for our kids being evidence-based, being research-based. I thought it was important to highlight some of John Hattie's work as he talks about some high-impact evidence-based practices. So one of the things that John Hattie found, and there's some great clips of Hattie that you can research, is that really anything we do as a teacher has a positive impact. Almost everything that we do in a classroom has a positive impact. What distinguishes it is whether it's a high impact or little to no impact. And so if you look at the slide and the column on the right of things with little to no impact, test-taking strategies, learning styles, ability grouping. Those are things that many of us have done in our classrooms for many years, and that's not to say they're bad. They're just things that don't have as much impact as the things on the left side of the screen. So I've taught learning styles. I've done learning style inventories as a teacher. The thing that research is saying about learning styles is that you typically are not a kinesthetic learner in everything that you do. And so it might be good to incorporate kinesthetic activities into your lesson planning, but that doesn't mean that I myself always am going to learn from the kinesthetic style. And you can apply that to all the other learning styles as well. So it might have a place in your lesson plans. It's just not maybe the way that some of us have learned to do that. And you can also see on the left some of the key things that Hattie says through his meta-analysis are really strong practices that drive a lot of what we do. So things like direct instruction, teaching study skills, providing feedback, problem-solving skills, metacognitive skills, getting students to think about how they're learning and think about how they're thinking. These are things that you may also want to spend some time researching as you think about the activities coming up this week. So some great research here and things that hopefully you can apply to your classroom right away, and that will help you as you go through the next week. So this week you're going to read chapter 4, which is specific to talking about how we work with students with learning disabilities. There's a discussion post about the Fat City video and learning disabilities and what your takeaways were from that. And then your assignment, as we've been talking about, is to do some additional research on a practice that you'd like to learn more about and reflect on how you can use that in your classroom. One thing I did want to point out, several of you, I made comments on your assignments this week specific to APA, and I just wanted to direct you to some online resources. There is a resource that's at the ONU library, the Benner Library, that can help you with APA. One of the things I like about the Benner Library resource is it shows you a template for APA that you can use. I also really like the Purdue OWL program. So anytime I have an APA question, I actually go to Purdue first because I like the way it's formatted and organized so that I can really quickly analyze my question and figure out how do I address that in APA. So both of those I think could be useful. I've put these links directly in Module 3. So if you want to do any more investigation into APA, those links are there as well. If you have any questions this week, feel free to reach out to me. I will be reaching out to each of you individually, most likely this week or early next week, and check in with how you're doing in the class. I've really enjoyed your work, and I hope you have a great week. Talk to you later.